Alrighty. Hello, welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, Zach Markowski, and today we'll be looking at some more philosophical topics and ideas in the realm of technology or cyberspace itself, and its relation specifically to what we once called the human or human beings, the human subject, to now say these human subjects have turned into objects. So how does that now affect their being in time? Because the environment that we inhabit today is far changed and removed from our ancestral home ground. Anything like a first order reality ceased existing a long time ago and was overlaid with our large network and kind of at this point global system of economics. So, what we have here today is a look at a talk called Seduced and Abandoned: The Body in the Virtual World, or the Feminine Cyberspace. And this is from the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London back in March 12th, 1994. And there's a talk from a few feminist scholars, thinkers, I don't know what they prefer, whatever they prefer to be called, cyborgs, I guess, but essentially women of good taste. And so they have some really fascinating observations of not just the way the contemporary machine world had already created or mythologized man and woman, but then how it was further, I guess you could say, absorbing them. If there's something that could be said of the postmodern condition, it would be something how the human being emerged from the void just in time as it emerged to create a sense of itself. That self was gobbled up by a larger world order. And that's essentially what we're going to get to the root of today. And it's not like this is new. This is what I want to make clear. It's like, yes, its current incarnation as a totalitarian, insurmountable global commercial force is unprecedented in its effects on the world and, again, the human subject who has disappeared into the machinery, right, into the cyberspace. The anonymity of the human has been granted back, right? It's a certain sort of freedom, but it's a terrible freedom insofar as humans for all of history were surrounded more by other people. And what defines the modern or the postmodern subject, the postmodern posthuman, is that they're surrounded and their lives are surrounded by objects more than people. And they spend more of their lives relating to objects and furniture and technology than they do people. That's probably a good way of saying it. Um, so for a lot of people, it's a disaster. For people who know how to entertain themselves or write their own philosophy, they stand a chance. All right, so here we have it, the feminine cyberspace with Sadie Plant.
Right. Well, as usual, I've got too many pieces of paper and not enough time. So I'm
Great place to begin. I absolutely know what she means. I have too many pieces of paper, too many napkins, and you don't want to see the other rooms.
going to go for the information density approach and throw lots of things out. But as people know, I will be here all weekend, so I hope there'll be lots of time for discussion, both after I've finished just now and also over the rest of the weekend. There's a couple of things which have come up this morning, which are themes and ideas that I want to sort of take issue with in this paper, which is basically about the idea of getting out of the meat, a notion to which I'm indebted to Pat Cadigan, amongst other cyberpunk writers. And the whole question of what the meat actually is in cyberpunk and, of course, in real life. Um, the two ideas that have came up this morning that I was particularly noticed are, first of all, this notion of cyberspace and the virtual being something of a metaphor or a symbolic zone or somehow some immaterial space. This is one idea that I really want to contest. The second is that there's the notion that it's somehow necessary from a woman's point of view to go in and somehow feminize cyberspace according to some usually pre-existing notion of the feminine. And I want to suggest really that the matrix, as I hope you'll see by the time I've finished, is already very much hostile to masculine identity, and that there's no great need for us to rush in and somehow turn it into something female.
That didn't stop them, did it? And I don't say that with any offense or real concern with women because I actually understand that, they're just playing their parts too. Just as man was machined to do his part and his bidding as was ordered, woman was no different, which is kind of what they're going to get into. But she's noting back in 1994 that while there's this concern for, again, just like everywhere else in civilization, curbing male identity, male aggression, right? Wherever there's men, there's fighting, there's pissing on fence posts, there's arguing, right? There's bashing each other's skulls in, and this is no longer a suitable way of life after, millions and billions of people now surround the planet. It's just it's a very unfortunate and ape-like reaction to give to just the basic day-to-day life, yet it's never stopped since we've been here. So she's talking about now that we're creating another second or third, essentially order reality, you can't now go pretending that this is the new metaphor. Like this is the prima materia, right? This is the fabled philosopher's stone that is going to fix our problems. Similarly, that you think you can go in there and engineer it to be hostile to man or life. It's almost like saying too late. It already is by nature. These women are going to tell us why.
But first of all, on this question of cyberspace itself being supposedly immaterial, a matter of symbolism, metaphor, an imaginary zone. Um, this is really the tendency to make cyberspace, as to make many things, into a matter of metaphor or representation, is really a matter of repeating the great idealist project which has characterised Western patriarchal culture, which has always been an attempt to somehow climb out of matter, to get into some immaterial zone, a zone that would be both insubstantial and ineffectual, those two senses of the word immaterial. And we can see even with this with cyberpunk itself.
It goes back to Socrates, follows with Jesus and the rest. We went from living in an elemental world where appearance is reality, so no need to go deeper than the skin, ultimately, right, to take joy in the skin and the voluptuousness of life, versus this idea that this is an evil world, right, that we're going to escape somehow. And this duality, this Manichaean thought, this Zarathustrian prospect of Zoroastrianism, which kind of took over in the monotheistic world, where it had to be narrowed down to morality. Good and evil is reflected in how people treat each other to create viable social orders that could survive, the violence and identity of men and women.
That even after there's been so much said about the collapse between of the distinction between social reality and science fiction, that people still want to make cyberpunk itself into simply a matter of fiction, again a metaphor somehow for our.
All right, and I thought sometimes I had dry mouth. Yes, she might be gacked out at the moment, right? She might be on the A. It might just be Mets. She's just tweaking. um, don't hold it against her, or that doesn't make her arguments or her ideas any less valid, because most intellectual scientists and thinkers for the last 100 years have been on meth or amphetamines of some kind, right? All our tech bros, all our modern tech people, they're all on acid or mushrooms, or they're microdosing something, right? We, the Western world, we are a nation in a world of addicts, and we've long been this way, from sugar plantations to tobacco plantations to cyberplace plantations. It's just that the crop and the product have changed.
Our times. And this even after we've seen the real effect in the world, which cyberpunk has obviously already had. And even the body, finally, in this high-tech world, somehow it gets back onto the agenda, or perhaps onto the agenda for the first time. But again, it's a matter of metaphor. Even this session today is called The Body as Metaphor. Metaphor for what is the question that I want to really be asking. And this tendency to turn everything into immateriality is really, as I say, an old trick of Western patriarchy. And cyberspace can, of course, always be seen, and has been seen largely, as the fulfillment of this great dream, again, of getting out of the meat, getting out of matter. As I say, it's an ancient dream. It really goes back at least as far as to the sort of sources of Western philosophy with Socrates, who himself says, if ever we are to have pure knowledge of anything, we must get rid of the body and contemplate things by themselves with the soul by itself. So Socrates, and consequently the whole history of Western culture, has really dreamt of some notion of the soul being separate and independent of the body. He says, it seems as long as we are alive, we will continue closest to knowledge if we avoid as much as we can all contact and association with the body, except when absolutely necessary. And instead,
So already he's moving into his head. away from the world around him, reality as it appears, right? And perhaps maybe Greece is getting a bit too dingy, There they are, philosophize, there he is, writing his plays in the aftermath of the Athenian Civil War, right? So maybe as he's looking at the reality and the human culture that's in decay and collapsing around him, he's realizing that this model isn't exactly viable. We're going to need to be more rational. And then we've chased that through to its logical conclusion, in which case you see people wind up right back at the beginning, thinking they're having novel thoughts, and even something like Freudian psychoanalysis and the Marxist revolution becomes the same old sublimation, chasing the ego through ironic levels of sublimation all over again. But we're going to get into these details.
Instead of allowing ourselves to become infected with its nature, purify ourselves from it until God himself gives us deliverance. So there's very much this attempt to be purified, to escape from the body, to escape its contamination. As I say, it's inevitable that cyberspace would, of course, have been welcomed into this sort of culture as the ultimate chance to finally make this escape from the meat, or, as I say, to become simply a symbolic zone, an immaterial zone. Finally, we get to the
Right, hyper reality. Finally, you can become a godlike image. You can edit it to be just perfect and then put it up online, for future civilizations. If an alien race ever descends to Earth and finds the ruins of us, what they will find is that we were obsessed with ourselves, obsessed with the image of ourselves, and that we wanted to put forth our ideal image to the world as if to prove this is what we are, this is what we're like. No one else can interpret us, no one else can understand us. We have there's one code, one answer, and it really is escape. It's always been escape.
the great dream of Western culture, the body as metaphor, finally removed from all of its visceral activity, its blood and guts, and all the messy stuff that man would always rather have left behind. And so cyberspace does really feed, obviously, this dream for total control, for autonomy, for the perfect end of the great Western patriarchal project, the great resolution of the masculine identity crisis.
The God in the machine. Finally, we were going to have all our answers. The Deus ex machina was going to solve all our problems. It was going to make life good. It was going to, the giant robot brain was going to make things as brainless and easy as possible forever.
The point at which the soul would finally be united with itself. And of course, all this has been encouraged in fiction and in film and so on by series like, for example, Oliver Stone's Wild Palms, by The Lawnmower Man. Again, all of these great dreams of immortality, of becoming God, of finally making it to a pure, insubstantial, omnipotent sense of identity. Now, of course, the whole notion of the virtual and of cyberspace is indeed a part, and from the human perspective, it has indeed been produced by this very desire for total control, for final autonomy, escape from the meat in that sense. But it too has also been programming the human identity which has been seeking this. No one, it turns.
Let me just point out real quick, what matters here is that since we invented our first mediums, going from speaking to drawing and writing to all these other mediums, as we progress through the years and through the centuries and the millennium, uh, it happened so that whenever we would come to occupy and live in and work around a new medium here in the West, right, whether that was writing, then eventually the printing press, then eventually, the telephone and the telegram and all these other mediums. No one escapes from the meat, even though we go and live in these old mediums, right, and pretend like this is what our reality is. That's why we can never see the present, and we have to leave that to a future generation to interpret it. Basically, because we become so enmeshed in our reality, we don't see, by the time we ourselves as human beings become obsolete, by the time we become fossils. And I know someone might argue with this, but I'll go, okay, how many buggy manufacturers do we need? How many horse buggy manufacturers does the modern world need, right? And then when the telephone put the telegraph out of service, right? How many telegraph delivery men did we need? The answer is zero, right? So we constantly have to create new needs, new desires, new differentiations. But the point is, in these mediums, is that people are not inhabiting that first world reality that we can kind of invent after the fact to say, hey, look, how those old people used to live. The one thing we can at least say for sure is we're not the same people and we don't live the same as them. Everyone else speculates, but it's all just that speculation. The code of rationality says no, there's one interpretation, there's one correct interpretation, there's one right way for beings to be in this world. It's kind of convenient then that it's solely economic, right? But let's keep going.
Instead, it's a matter of getting caught up with it. The body, it turns out, is never left behind. Instead, it's the body itself which begins to learn how to disentangle itself from all Oedipalized constraints. Already, we can see this in all of the sort of cultural fallout from cyberspace and VR, drugs, cybersex, prosthetics, bondage, data suits. There's a convergence of all these sort of outlaw channels on which the body, which Socrates was quite happy to dismiss as merely some sort of vehicle, some carrier for man's great dreams, sort of the raw material for his own adventures, the body begins now to return in a very different form to this empty, vacuous shell which was left behind in the past. And now we can see this.
Right. It's a hell of a time to wake up from the dream and possibly see reality. And maybe if there's a history to the 20th century that still needs to be reinterpreted and retold, it will be that, right? It would be that, hey, look, just when these people are pretending they're civilized and they have these world orders and they got it all figured out and they can organize themselves by nations and states and these giant global orders, you see that now they get more violent on a scale, on not just more violent but nihilistically so, in scales and in means and measures and ways that the individual person cannot comprehend and that all of history has never witnessed before.
Great dream as well of the whole of Western patriarchal culture really heading into crisis. Digitisation, it seems, is integral to a process of what is now actually quite overtly and quite frequently being named as feminisation. There are a number of processes which are
Right. What I say about, hey, did you realize 10,000 years ago when they had the first laws and things like that, that it was already tiresome that men were reactive, violent, very picky and particular about their identity, if not completely thoughtless or kind of dumb and slow to begin with, and that we've been having to drag and deal with people all along in such manners, that style of, hey, I'm just going to bash whatever moves, that style of being in the world got tiresome from men thousands of years ago, that we began to constrain it in new and unforeseen ways. Let's keep going.
again are all converging, which now find man, in his own words, and this is actually quoting Jeremy Paxman on a Newsnight programme quite recently, which now find man adjusting to irrelevance. Or
Hey, it's not irrelevance, it's uselessness or worthlessness or having no value as a human being, no value as an animal, and no value as an object. In fact, life insurance tells you a lot of people are worth more dead than alive. So it's kind of funny how this husbandry works. But she's not saying that civilization will stop needing men to do all the dirty work, that civilization will stop needing men to do all the hard labor, that civilization will stop needing men to do all the murder and the war and the mayhem. Like, she's not saying that men are going away, and she's not saying that the mercenaries will stop being employed by these large, powerful organizations. What she's saying is that outside these strict institutional authorities, men just don't exist. But this is, in a certain sense, this is what women have been dealing with all along. So there's this idea in the modern world that men are falling behind, women are getting ahead, women have replaced men in the job force and in college and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, kind of. Women, turns out, with how antisocial and difficult men are, with how disagreeable they are, in a world order that can only privilege a few, that means you have to imprison, control, tame, or eject the rest. It's no different than there's one queen bee in a colony, the rest are females, and after the mating is done, they eject the males. They don't need them anymore, right? So they have a function. They just don't have a worth or a value. So men are still needed as like kind of disembodied, identityless machines chained to the machines. But now I'm getting ahead of ourselves. I'll further explain. I promise you, this isn't sci-fi. This isn't fiction. You might wish it is, but let's keep going.
Or to quote another recent paranoid response to this, the fact that man is becoming the disposable sex.
We always have been.
It seems it takes an
Uteruses and eggs have always been more valuable and necessary than, I mean, do the simple math of it. Do the Socratic math or the American accounting. One man can impregnate all the women. One woman and all the men, is that's just a disaster, right? That's a dangerous position for her to be in. That's right. So it's very different value scale, right? And the problem is with those, even with a lot of men and able bodies, if you only have one woman capable of reproducing, then that also limits your survival and your tribe's going to die out if you're down to that. But let's keep going.
responsible feminism, which may indeed not be any sort of feminism at all, to try and trace all of the paths on which, on the one hand, woman begins to assemble herself as a new and unprecedented force in contemporary culture, and also to track these processes whereby masculine identity and the figure of man in that abstract sense is finally being undermined. And what I want to suggest is that all of our notions, or most of feminism's previous notions of what woman is and what
Finally being undermined. When he was like dying in the slave mines for all history, I think he already was. He was being put out to pasture and stud then, right? The raising and breeding of like human husbandry has been a thing forever. All ruling classes do it to their populations and their masses, whether we're talking the Egyptians and the pharaohs and their slaves and people, or whoever.
what women may be, and consequently what women's relation to technology may be, are really to be found wanting. That woman is neither man-made or somehow man's other. She's not biologically fixed from an essentialist point of view, nor is she sort of wholly absent and not there at all with the Lacanians and the deconstructionists. Instead, she is actually in a process which has been going on for some time.
So she's trying to, in a certain sense, free the feminine from the tyranny of order, which is to say, I guess if men, at the very least, patriarchy, gay, like, this guy was going to charge the battlefield and get blown into smithereens, but at least you'd give his family a medal afterward. There was merit or recognition to whatever he was once doing. Women have always been used, like they've long been used to being constructions of man, as she said. Who is woman? She's a mythology that was invented by man. So to this day, we're still working off of these mythological terms: human being, man, woman. These aren't absolutes, which is kind of what she's getting into. And she's pointing out that through all history, women have been communicating and drawing from each other's intelligence because, once the master leaves, once the owner leaves, then, it's kind of like that saying, when the cat's away, the mice will play, right? Women have always been dealing with this, hey, we can't be honest around this guy, but we're going to talk behind his back, right? Because gossip is information, and information is knowledge, and knowledge is power. So women have long been arguably organizing and congregating, and part of the modern world, and the modern world as such couldn't have been built without them. Because as Sadie's going to talk about, she's long been playing her part, but that doesn't mean she winds up being that ideal construction that man made her, nor exactly is she this total mythology that the post-structuralists tend to say she is, right? Oh, there's nothing essential about women. I don't know, genetic code, right? But we'll get to that.
This process of feminisation is also the great clarion cry, which really seems to again be coming from an old sort of sense of masculine identity, is summed up by, again, a guy who was on TV probably about a month ago on a programme about men, who, again, with a great tone of paranoia, said, "Women and robots are taking our jobs." And it's that dual
There it is.
attack, which clearly suggests that there is some connection made, at least in the minds of this old power centre, between women and intelligent machines. And indeed, you can look back over the whole history of feminism and begin to see some sort of emergent pattern whereby the status of machinery, in any sense, particularly in terms of means of communication, and also the status of women, have actually developed concurrently and have developed together. It seems that there is, therefore, some process of feminisation happening, which, as I say, we can trace back a long way. Though it's almost as though there are sort of fractal scales of a history which begin to fold in on each other. So, for example, with the beginnings of modernity, we have Mary Wollstonecraft writing about women as the first self-governing systems turn on. And by the first self-governing systems, I mean really Watt's steam engine and Adam Smith's market. Both of those steam into a modern age, which is already waiting for Mary Shelley, another crucial figure, to dream our future, to dream a future marked by cyborg revenge. Then there's a second wave, in effect, with the burst of technical and economic activity generated by the Second World War. Norbert Wiener's systems hit a deuteroplane on which machines begin to learn how to learn, and Simone de Beauvoir writes The Second Sex. After that, there's a third phase where it gets far more complicated, just as, of course, we could expect an age of complexity to get more complicated.
Right. Rise in complexity. As American professor Rick Roderick points out, it's far easier for people to say everything's bullshit, everything's stupid, no need to understand it, just be cynical, just be miserable, just kind of maintain a shitty attitude about it, rather than do a little bit of research, do a little bit of understanding, try and understand who and what you are in this world and why that might matter at all. Maybe human life does matter. Maybe our social relations do matter. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm the stupid one. Maybe I mistook that life was about beings, human beings for us as human beings, if we can still be called that, which I would argue I don't think we can. I think this is the postmodern condition. These are a lot of them are posthumans, and that's not an improvement. Otherwise, she wouldn't, these women wouldn't be here. They would have been happy with what the world had created for them because that's what they're supposed to be, right? Look, woman, we slayed all the buffalo. You got a nice warm home. You got electricity. You got all the fashion in the world. What are you still on about? What's wrong now? Let's see.
And it seems that it is with digitisation, with which all the gaps in the material, Freud is famous for calling women gaps in the material, all the gaps in the material begin to replicate themselves. By the time
It's like see, and that's closer to that representation of the primordial four elements, which are more closer to non-material, which annihilates the visible world.
Lucy Rigaray, who's a French feminist writer, writes her classic text, Speculum of the Other Woman, it seems that de Beauvoir's second sex has already begun to turn onto her own perspective, effectively scratching at the silverings behind her glass, leaking in through the holes in her veils. This is a time of emergent self-organisation, the late 70s, the 80s, until the present time. It's a period in which all the substances of the world grow dangerous to those who wanted to claim it for themselves. Right across the board, you can see this happening. Machines begin to learn how to learn. Systems begin to access
They
their own
took our
controls and make
jobs.
contact with each other. They begin to hack into their own functioning and explore their own intelligence. This happens amongst women, it happens amongst machines. Viral infections creep out from the software plane, again stealing the future away from those who thought it was promised to them. Repeating patterns sweep across the once so simple screens as a reality studio, fracturing the scenery and ripping up the plans. Systems begin to assemble.
Right. That idea that it was just going to be modernity forever, right? The moment modernity arrives, it says, hey, now we're human beings. Now we got it figured out. Now we're living. By the time that can be instantiated into a global system, there's not enough materials in the world to give everyone this bourgeoisie, middle class, American styled imperialist existence, right? There's no more frontiers to imperialize, including the human mind. That can be monetized, but I'm thinking there's a reason our intellectuals have gotten, you know, shorter lived over the years, more insane. Why we don't produce philosophers like we used to, right? There's this question of, well, why can't we just keep making, European type thinkers who looked at the beauty and truth of life? And it's because you guys have been running from these things for so long that, you've annihilated your conception of yourself and the world. So it creates for a lot of confusion. Like we said, right? Better to just say it's all stupid or be cynical than take a look into the complexity. But I want to say that it was even around this time in the 90s while Roderick's lecturing, Terence McKenna was lecturing, and what he warned the people, the kind of liberal people who'd come to him of his time, because he wasn't exactly an institutional figure. He existed at a time and a place where you could still kind of exist outside of an institution even. But what he brought to bear was saying, hey, all you people who invested in imperialism and racism and sexism and the same old business as usual, if you thought this next century was just going to be another repeat without interruption, without trouble, without all sorts of problems, both seen and unforeseen, you got another thing coming. And that's exactly what Sadie was saying here back in 1994. Like I said, it was this exact point in time, and I was, getting to be a tween and a teen here in the 90s. But, I could remember seeing what was going on around me in the world as a reflection of all these things these people are talking about. So it's interesting to go back and look at the people during your younger life's present trying to put their finger on just what is the pulse of the time, what is the vibe of the time. And at this point, we're arriving at ultimate complexity that's going to blow the human world apart. Basically, human apocalypse is what we're talking.
Assemble themselves on trade routes and lines of communication, which were never, of course, designed to do their own thing. We see complex emergencies exciting themselves in the banking systems, the weather systems of a global economy, which now begins to tip into its own systemic activity. Even the commodities, the medicines, all of the go-betweens, all of those things once so well behaved as goods for the benefit of man, which is in fact the dictionary definition of the commodity, even those commodities themselves get smart. It seems that every patrilineal thread, every straight line of history begins to run onto a non-linear plane. And it's hardly surprising, therefore, that woman herself turns on. She too has been a means of communication for man, and they all effectively turn on together. And now we find ourselves at a time, as I say, where masculine identity is, as a consequence of this long history, in serious crisis. There's a feeling that man is losing responsibility, authority, definition, resolution, memory, you name it, he feels he's losing it. Postmodernity, in fact, we could almost describe as being man's
See, and that's contingent on believing or thinking you ever had those to begin with, or that they weren't just momentary stops in time.
hysterical reaction to all these new lacks and privations, the wounds that he incurs as control apparently migrates. If we look at Baudrillard as obviously a classic example, finding himself suddenly, apparently at the end of history, at the end of the history in which he himself had invested so much, suddenly seduced and abandoned.
So there's where the title comes from. But I want to say Baudrillard kind of makes clear, end of the world, end of things as we knew it, no going back, no going forward, leaves fatal strategy, right? He was pretty aware, but she's going to point out something grim here.
But I want to suggest that, in fact, the Baudrillards of this world will wish it was indeed that simple. It would be very nice, I think he'll end up thinking, if he was, in fact, abandoned by all these processes.
Right? Because the idea of being abandoned means you could at least be left to yourself. What if you're chained to the machine for eternity and there's no escaping it? No matter where you run, no matter where you hide, it can and will find you, right? These are the types of global totalizing technocracy that we're talking about: worldwide surveillance, worldwide data files on every human being, nowhere to hide, nowhere to go. Every thought will be monetized, and right, I'm not saying this is the way it's going to be. I'm saying this is already the way it is. And then if you want to see a depiction of that in media from not so long ago, I'll recommend, was it not The Island, but The Prisoner, British series, was it back in the 70s, where secret agent winds up on an island and everything's perfect or too perfect, and what they want from him is information. They're trying to get inside his noodle and get what they want from him, and they're not going to stop, and there's no freedom and there's no escape, and even if he tries to leave the island, they're going to bring him back by any means necessary. So that's what she's talking about. When Baudrillard says something like, "Hey, you've been abandoned. Whether you've been seduced or abandoned, here you are. You've come to the end." It's like you might want to leave the end, but the end will not leave you.
But in fact, man is not abandoned but hooked. It turns out that he too is a machine component of the processes which now threaten his identity collapse. Seduction was not a pleasure, or not only a pleasure, but also a trap. And
Thanks,
suddenly,
woman.
after so many years of it being woman who is one who is lacking and somehow missing something, suddenly it's masculinity, is that strong sense of identity.
She's saying it back in the mid 1990s, and then if you've seen the kind of tripe that goes around in the modern American media, they've been talking about that for a long time. Oh, the masculinity crisis, the this, that, and the other, and it's like these people are decades behind. Do you see that? They're still living in the 20th century. These people, like in America, see, and there's a problem. In America, we're going to be in modernity forever, at least until we're done for. And by that, I mean America basically invented late modernity, the Industrial Revolution in a certain sense. I know, the Britain was right there too, as well as the other developed European nations. But I'm trying to make a point that America made it big. America makes everything big. It makes it bigger than big, larger than life. So America always takes things to its logical conclusions because that's what a utopia that's what it can do.
Which becomes a liability, which becomes a lack. But it would be a big mistake to want to simply turn the tables around and suggest that the past somehow belonged to man and now the future will belong to woman, and we simply have a role
Nope,
reversal
she's
here.
hooked too.
Men too are moving on. Soon they'll have a few new wounds and a few new sockets in place, and neurochemical programming, it seems, is already well underway. On this last point, of course, cyberpunk is the great place, again, where you do get this theme of neurochemical reprogramming. What Bruce Sterling has called the theme of mind invasion does, of course, run through every cyberpunk novel. Again,
Right, no escape. Right? You think you're entering the matrix, like that's just your addiction speaking. You think it's cradling you. No, it owns you, it holds you. Uh, maybe you do or don't want to see your chains, right? Maybe there's a reason people need to think they do. Maybe there's a reason. And at this point, it doesn't even matter because we're getting to a post-psychoanalysis world. But
always as an attack and a corruption of a solid older sense of identity. Cyberpunk, he writes, crunches together neuro and physical chemistry, genetic biology, structural linguistics, cybernetics, biotechnology, cyborg engineering into a fantastic series of fictions. And I'm sure most of the audience is familiar with the speed, the complexity, the intensity, the
right, let's
montage.
go.
They share a variety of aesthetic impulses and influence spiritual transcendent plane. Now, it is indeed true that, as another commentator has pointed out, the discourses of visionary virtual world builders is rife with images of imaginal bodies, again freed from the constraints that flesh imposes. It seems, however, that those seeking transcendence will probably be better off reading Mills and Boon, but certainly be sorely disappointed in a future marked by the actualisation of images, the materialisation of matter, and indeed the emergence of a new and perhaps fatally constraining flesh. When drugs and sex and what Gibson calls the dance of biz begin to mutate across the cyberpunk stage, ecstasy is no longer the state of escaping matter, but instead a matter of escaping the state, be it of the art, the nation, or the mind itself. The state is the obstacle to what becomes the question of getting out of order, a flight away from the ideal, away from transcendence, a way out from the notion of identity and masculinity. This is never, in cyberpunk novels, even though many cyberpunk commentators want to suggest this, it's never a transcendent exit from the body. Instead, it's a headlong acceleration into his substance. And I quote Gibson on this score, saying, "He knew, he remembered, as she pulled him down to the meat, the flesh the cowboys mocked. It was a vast thing, beyond knowing, a sea of information coded in spiral and pheromone, infinite intricacy that only the body, in its strong blind way, could ever read." Or again, you can see this collision with materiality in Kadri's book Metrophage. He tore open one of the packs, slopping gin on the floor, and popped a purple capsule under his nose. The cobra toxin came on like a slow-burning volcano, boiling along the surface of his brain, not enough to kill him or cause permanent damage, just enough to cop the killing euphoria from the cobra venom. His body was molten glass and treacle, no flesh, no bones, just a sizzling mass of plasma, fried eyes and melting genitals. 30 seconds later, he popped the modified atropine, its molecular web constructed in the mirror image of the cobra toxin. And as the inside of his skull iced over, the room exploded into negative as white glacial light blazed behind his eyes and shot down his spinal column. This, it would seem, is why drugs are always considered to be so dangerous. They do, in fact, bring the body back close to home, too close to home, in fact, for the whole Western notion of identity to cope with. Again, they effectively collapse the body onto what was conceived previously as the mind or the spirit or the soul of man and force its fluids into this soul. They're wraps of materiality, tabs of tactility, chilling reminders again of the blood and guts and all the visceral matter from which man sought to extract this pure and unadulterated soul, which Socrates spoke of again. And so clearly this is not the body as metaphor. We're not dealing with here the body as some immaterial zone. It's true that Kadri's character finds himself escaping flesh and bones, but what he encounters is this sizzling mass of plasma, fried eyes, melting genitals and so on. There's nothing immaterial about that. Likewise, the notion that this notion of the body as a sort of complex and melted out system that you get to in a lot of cyberpunk novels, especially via this line of thought and line of inquiry via neurochemical reprogramming, is precisely that which we meet on the other end vis-a-vis computers themselves. I just want to
Well, hey, after millennia of dirty, hard, nasty work, you'd be burnt out and melted out too.
throw out a few quotes. First of all, from Marshall McLuhan, who made this point many years, obviously, before it was widely taken up. Again, on the theme of drugs, particularly psychedelics. It is not, he says, uncommon for people on these trips, especially with new chemical drugs as opposed to organic ones, to develop the illusion that they are themselves computers. This, he says, is not so much a hallucination as a discovery.
Might as well be.
The point's been reinforced recently by Manuel de Landa, who in an interview says, when you trip, you liquefy structures in your brain, linguistic structures, intentional structures. They acquire a less viscous consistency, and your brain becomes a supercomputer. Another quote from Snow Crash. That's a hypercard. I thought you said Snow Crash was a drug, Hero says, totally nonplussed. It is, the guy says. Try it. Does it fuck up your brain, Hero says, or your computer? Both, neither. What's the difference?
What's the difference?
That's a mixture of fictional and so-called theoretical observations about this same point of a certain moment in which the notion of the body and the computer begin to collapse on each other. My own slight experience of LSD, writes Gregory Bateson, led me to believe that Prospero was wrong when he said, we are such stuff as dreams are made on. It seemed to me that the pure dream was, like pure purpose, rather trivial. It was not the stuff of which we are made, but only bits and pieces of that stuff. Our conscious purposes, again, are only bits and pieces. The systemic view is something else again. So we have this systemic view of the organism, which begins to emerge out of this old constraint of body and soul being separated from each other. And from here, the organism no longer understands itself to be some discrete, physically bounded, autonomous entity of historical progress and social security. But as Basin defines it, it becomes not a transcendent entity as self is commonly supposed to be, and what we understand as its ideas are immanent in a network of causal pathways, which he says is not bounded by the skin, but includes all external pathways along which information can travel. So here we have a very material notion of communication systems and of information systems of the body and the computer collapsing onto each other. Now, it seems that this notion of a spread out sense of post-self, if you like, not bounded by the skin, but as Bateson says, taking into account all material pathways.
Oh, that's what it is. It's that because we've changed so much, our shadows can no longer get ahead of ourselves. We can't have a future, right? This has been phrased in any number of ways, but basically, um, whether inside or outside the matrix, with modern rational thought, the God and the machine, the acquiring of genomes, let's say, that the way that works is that you can't escape it all. You used to at least be able to think, geez, what is the afterlife going to be like? And now you cannot escape this one reality in which the human subject, who has no shadow any longer, right? This is Nietzschean territory, it's Baudrillardian territory, uh, you know, that with those removed, we're left with it's essentially last man territory. We are left with a selfless subject. This animal who was formerly called the human being, idealized as man, woman, a reflection of the eternal, immutable God who is the cause of everything and therefore above everything, and therefore all humans and human beings were subject to, right? We don't have any of that anymore. Yes, some people have them, but everyone else in the world with like who is involved in reality, who isn't, buying into the mythologies and the fictions. It's like, all right, you can have that. We'll go take the money and the power and the technology and the bombs. You can have the imaginary reality. It's kind of what happened to philosophy compared to like analytics or math. So let's keep going.
Is a notion of identity which has previously never been acceptable or even thinkable or conceivable to Western patriarchal culture. And yet it seems that woman has always been somehow in proximity to this now emerging notion of a dispersed, decentered organism. She has, after all, never had a unified role. This is the one thing which women have always been denied. She's been various things, of course: mirror, screen, commodity, means of communication, means of reproduction, carrier of water, weaver of the cloth, carer, whore, machine assemblage, in other words, in the service of the
Broodmare.
species, a sort of general purpose system of simulation and self-simulation. While she's always, of course, been forced to marry into the
Right. Men get upset because women aren't what they think they are or what they think they should be. Right? No different than any other animal, I guess. If it doesn't obey you, if it doesn't abide by your fences and your rules and your thoughts, right? If this world isn't what you think it is, it's a recipe for frustration, more or
family of
less.
man and assume a so-called human identity, it seems that something of her outlaw status has always remained. She too has had to adhere to Asimov's laws, which we saw a moment ago up on the screen. The machines and the women, both of them together, have had to promise to honour and obey. And of course, some have done so
Death do you
more
part.
happily than others. But certainly, again, if we look back over the history of modernity, we see a whole history of very unhappy fitting into this constraining notion of human identity. We can look.
Think of the yellow wallpaper, right? Certain feminist literature like that, where something like frustration or discontent was seen as a mental illness. Oh, you're not happy for the cage we've constructed for you? What's wrong with you? You're hysterical, woman. Kind of that kind of thing.
Look at hysteria and say that that was effectively the 19th century's expression of women's protest against the confines of a humanism, which on the one hand always demanded their complicity, but on the other hand refused them full membership of the species that they were supposedly serving. Hysteria, of course, literally is the wandering womb, the womb wandering, the machinery seeking an exit, looking for a way
Right.
out.
The robots on the factory assemblage line are not supposed to question their own programming. That's defective itself. To even have a question as a programmed machine, as a programmable program machine, to have a question is already offensive. To have a joke is also offensive, kind of goes from there.
Out of this organised one, hunting for the plane it becomes, what Deleuze and Guattari call the matrix whose colours are yet to come. And even if, like Simone de Beauvoir, woman has wanted nothing more than to lose this connection to this plane and to become fully human, to become a full subject, it seems that she's always at least been beginning elsewhere. Even Simone de Beauvoir described woman's subordination not to man, but to the species.
Broodmares.
Now, it seems but we have now a number of options being presented through the work of Donna Haraway and many other women working in the area where women and technology come into close proximity with each other. And the notion of the cyborg is, of course, one of the most, has in the past, I suppose, been one of the most fruitful ideas about how this conjunction happens. But the cyborg equally is always in danger of being brought back into the anthropomorphic tale. Again, we just saw a few moments ago the way in which robots are always anthropomorphized, and the cyborg itself is anthropomorphized. It's the notion of the organism itself which is the problem. It's the organized member of the species which has really been the problem for women in the past.
Right. Kind of like that Homer Simpson's joke. If you've seen the episode of The Simpsons where he shoots Marge with the makeup gun, that's kind of what it is. It's the whole, maybe I'll cut that in.
Now, this next one's for the ladies. I invented this revolutionary makeup gun. It's for the woman who only has 4/5 of a second to get ready. Close your eyes, Marge. And now you're ready for a night on the town.
Homer, you've got it set on whore.
Oop. Okay, this time try to keep your nostrils closed. Oh, look what you did. Now I have to go get my cold cream gun.
Dad, women won't like being shot in the face.
Women will like what I tell them to like.
It's the whole be what I say you are, be what I need you to be. But this is kind of the game, right? Like, okay, sure, man will paint the fence when he'll go fight the wars so long as woman does the laundry or whatever, right? And I'm not trying to say that the unwaged labor of millennia of women or men hasn't had a place. That's kind of the thing, is that while the mythology of history is that we've been building these things up and this is what we created and liberated, the reality is it's like it's only ever been more constraint. It's only ever been more tyranny. It's only ever been more of the same.
There are suggestions, again, emerging in cyberpunk fiction and film especially, that women somehow already had some connection to the virtual. A little quote from Mona Lisa Overdrive from William Gibson. Her father, long ago in Arizona, had cautioned her against jacking in. You don't need it, he'd said. And she hadn't, because she dreamed cyberspace, as though the neon grid lines of the Matrix waited for her behind her eyelids. If this was the case,
That's kind of funny about Terence McKenna's view of the prima materia was like a decade before iPhones had ever been invented. He sort of saw them something similar, but he thought maybe it would be something like contact lenses, and then you would just see the menus. You could close your eyes and see and access the menus that way. So this idea of a perfect substance in a perfect world, whether that's to create or escape, is bound up in the flesh, right? That's been the fantasy and the dream all along. And then the closest you come is material production and consumption. And then once that has its end, where does that leave you, right? It leaves you with a deconstructed reality, a denatured reality. It leaves you with cyberspace, the illusion of space, the illusion of reality.
if indeed woman does have some implicit prior connection to the Matrix, then it would be hardly surprising that women have so quickly become such advanced and fearless practitioners of virtual engineering. And it does seem indeed that most of the advanced and interesting work that's happening in this field is at the moment being done by women. It seems that all of the things which were once such a disadvantage to women in the past are now, with this process of digitisation, this slow but now the slow history of modernity, but the
Her pupils look huge.
accelerating process at the end of modernity are really now speeding up. And that if fluidity, for example, and women's ability to wear many hats, to fulfil many roles, and never to have a strong sense of unified self, has always been configured as a matter of deprivation and disadvantage in the past, it now becomes a positive advantage for a future in which identity is nothing more than a liability. It's digitisation, which is the process by which the feminine learns how to replicate itself.
Hold on. Did she just say in the future where identity is nothing more than a liability? She must have seen our time and before and then realized, God, it's a wasteland.
For a future in which identity is nothing more than a liability.
Whoof.
It's
Right.
digitisation.
So there's a lot of people who need to prove their identity, and that's the arena. And there's a lot of people who try to hide their identity because, the people who exist here wouldn't be as social creatures. People aren't happy when they realize how mean their neighbors are, let's say, right? Why have people been concerned with each other's business and morality forever? Well, because their ass is on the line. They're paranoid.
Which is the process by which the feminine learns how to replicate itself and the masculine ends up finding itself out on a limb. The process is concurrent across a number
Hey,
of zones.
we'll do what men have always done. Just saw that limb right off with the men on it. That's kind of what we do, right?
Everywhere we can see structures being invaded by systems, states being captured, governors being ignored, and conditions being enthralled by their own strange and fatal attractions. Woman's escape from masculine control has not turned out to be a consequence of her ability to somehow transcend her economic functions, transcend her reproductive functions. Their mutation.
Oh, now you'll be fumbling and fooling around as dumb as the dumbest of men for all time, thinking that there was something immaterial that would protect you or prove yourself to someone else, right? It's absurd.
Is also hers. The commodity is mutated into a smart commodity, mechanical reproduction, be it of the species or the work of art, has become a matter of replication, and lines of communication, again across the board, begin to organise themselves. The matrix that they become, or cyberspace, is simply matter turned on, the processing plane from which Zero hacks the central controls and assembles itself. Across the time intensity scales, there's a self-replicating pattern beginning to emerge as all channels of communication converge on the cyberspatial plane. Commodities become self-guiding. Capital, it seems, is now leaving the western lands for the ocean with the edge, the Pacific attractor. And out in the west, here where they still set the clocks, the old world order is beginning to fall behind the times. Machine intelligence is converging with a thinking organism as both get drawn onto this chemical plane on which intelligence discovers its own materiality, and communication now has visceral effect. Trans-dancers learn to get in touch.
Now, remember, the first televised trial that caused a riot, the O.J. Simpson riot, had just happened, right? South Central, all that stuff, LA in the early 90s. So this isn't just a simple spectacle anymore. This is where the the images on TV that are realer than real cause people reactions. Something like George Floyd is actually a continuation of where we left off. It's almost like history stopped for 30 years and then we picked up from yeah, at least here in American politics, after Rodney King, we picked up at George Floyd and then kind of, went nuts from there. But let's keep going.
Hitting the plateau with tantric precision, evading the climax, picking up the news. Even the fake mutates into simulation and makes contact with its own arousing machines. Identity has become entranced and enchanted at the limit of the organism, fascinated and facsimilar to the point at which the body tips over onto the plane. The entranced is the accessed, the possessed, the body ridden by its own network of potentialities. It's not just a matter of us going out from the meat, but also the matrix entering the organism.
He's sleeping.
So if the history of cybernetics and this history of modernity, which has also supposedly been the great goal, the great final thrust, if you like, of the Western patriarchal project, it turns out, it seems it's also really been a story of the feminisation of man. And if the history of cybernetics is indeed this history of feminisation, then of course
Socrates is one of the original best exemplars of the eternally feminine in man, right? We're going to talk our way through this. We're going to reason our way through this. Meanwhile, the men of his culture around him were pointing out, we already know the meaning of good and evil. We have our values. We already are, right? What are you talking about? What are you trying to do here? This is a weird card game you're trying to play, you know?
Of course, the great question is what happens to those women, in other words, or all of those who are considered never quite the same as him in the first place, those who are always systems of communication, now finding
Second-class
themselves
citizens
increasingly able to contact each other. Were they always somehow
who can have each other, right? Women, the natural, people as such, gregarious animals. Women fit better, it seems, into a largely non-hierarchical world of kind of relative pecking orders that are far removed from there is no centralized power, but the serious power is real and everywhere. So that women as little cliques and social groups can exist more easily and readily than men, given men's proclivities, given men's violence, given men's, because let's be honest, like the most dramatic men are bigger drama queens than women. Like they need people fussing about them. They need people to go, yes, sir, you're so important, right? They need the validation and attention too. In fact, without that, all of society would have meant nothing for all time. Because if it's the rich and the powerful who invent immortality, it's everyone else who models that because they're the only ones who can afford to live. Everyone else is guaranteed death, but only the rich and powerful and those who can survive the onslaught of change. Meanwhile, through all history, the masses of humanity have just been swept away by time, anonymously, with or without purpose, natural disasters, human-made disasters, you name it, right? So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about power and the ability to insulate yourself from the real threats in the real world.
in advance? Were they always in touch with something that was somehow out of sight that is now beginning to emerge for the first time?
And maybe, look, I don't claim to have all the answers, so that's why I'm examining these things. It turns out philosophy and thinking period, is a good bad place to go if you actually haven't or need to re-examine your initial suppositions, right? So I actually don't know. I was thinking just now, maybe men don't have a place. Maybe women are just more used to being non-entities. Maybe man will never fit in. Maybe we'll have to create into the future with the millions and billions of people. Maybe we'll need large concentration camps to hold all these violent, rowdy people because they're too much of a threat to the consumer or economic world order. I don't know. Let's keep going.
As the virtual. Maybe de Beauvoir was right in the end. After the first perhaps does come the second sex, not secondary, but second as in after the first.
Oh shit. She might be right. These women are smarter than most men. So maybe these are the supermen. Maybe these are the closest thing to the Ubermensch, the species, right? It's all that's Aristotle's idea. Um, Basically, what we're getting at here is, because it's funny, not only are they more intelligent, but they can actually create life. So it got me thinking that if anyone's beyond man at present, it seems to be woman, right? She's over it. She's over it. It's been thousands of years of the same banalities and bullshit, and then read it for what it is, though. So what you have are countless generations of people who struggled to survive for thousands of years, giving up. Right? They're not going to have families. They're not going to have futures. And I mean this for men and women alike, because remember what we're talking about with this large, crushing, shifting wave is that it's wiping out, countless families and people's dreams of the future, where eventually things will coalesce under new powers. And by then things have changed and you go, okay, we're not those people anymore because we don't act, believe, live, or think the same because everything has changed constantly. So let's keep going.
Human. I think in view of the time constraints, I'll just give you one last line.
Sorry, time constraint, always,
that women's
right?
emergence at the end of the millennium is man's emergency, that history was remembered, but the future, no one's in control, it's unmanned. Okay, thank you.
I like that. And this is what this was the one hope, that he put on offer. It's not that there aren't terrible forces. It's not that there's not total power. It's that, yeah, if you're lucky, maybe you will find a crack in between, right? You're not going to get in a forward escape like he suggested, but at most, maybe you'll actually be okay with life and not live a miserable life of panic and fear and drudgery and work as people have through all time. That people are miserable is not new. That people live lives of servitude and whose relations are primarily in the validation of others and being employed for their time by others. It's long been this way. Oh, but I meant to bring it up earlier when she mentioned Marshall McLuhan because I could have sworn it was here where she said it. Talking about Marshall McLuhan recognizing what does this techno-feudal world look like, right? What does it look like when man becomes appendage to the machine? Something like this, I think, actually.
Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian professor and the father of media communication, created one of the possibly most misquoted sentences. Man becomes, as it were, the sex organs of the machine world.
So that's the incorrect quote. Man becomes, as it were, the sex organs of the machine world. No. The machine world is closer to the flowers, and he's the busy bee. Physiologically, man in the normal use of technology or his variously extended body is perpetually modified by it and in turn finds new ways of modifying his technology. So if everyone is wondering, geez, why in the 90s and even now still are so many intellectuals and those types going on and on about cyborgs, this is why. As the bee of the plant world, enabling it to fecundate and evolve over ever new forms.
Without the first and latter parts of the quote, the meaning entirely changes from McLuhan's intended message.
Just like that. That's how it works. So coming back to Miss Plant here and the London Art Institute, let's go on a little bit more.
If I could just try and chart the ebb and flow of our presentations this afternoon, it seemed to me that we started with a history of women's exclusion from technology and ended up with a claim that the history of cybernetics
Right? Women never played a role in computers or mathematics or machines, right?
was in fact a history of feminisation and a marking out of woman's affinity with the machine. And I wanted to perhaps throw down, not so much as kind of gauntlets, but certainly as kind of questions to the speaker.
Affinity for the machine? Does the machine validate her being better than man? Is that what it is? Or does the machine tell her or not tell her what she is? Is that what makes it better? Or is it that it doesn't say anything at all, really, you know? I don't know. And I'm not going to say it doesn't say anything at all in the same way that I couldn't say, you know, this bit of technology, a book, this doesn't say anything at all, right? When in reality, writing's been the most psychedelic and potent technology in all of human existence. You know, and this gets back to our symbolic representation and what does it all mean and what does it mean for people. You know, Baudrillard, back to what Sadie was saying about, you know, the Baudrillards of the world are going to have a hard time when they recognize there is no escape, you know, because to illustrate what Baudrillard saw in 1968 is if to go hand in hand with that British TV show I mentioned, The Prisoner. Baudrillard says, all right, so here we have Baudrillard's system of objects, right? Let's see. And we're just going to look at the last few pages here, page 195, 196, right? Because remember, he's talking about this is, I think he writes this, then the consumer society. He's recognizing how a consumer society has changed from a production society, how the second and third world or third order representations have changed from societies of first order representation. So, Christian, pre-modern Europe who believed in God and whose life was built around these central themes that gave hierarchy, meaning, and the social, basically where everything was that kind of turtles all the way down perfect system, at least in terms of how they believed in it or could believe in it or created the edifice that they believed in as if to say they believed in it. If you build a massive church or cathedral, you might say, wow, that's powerful belief that inspired you to do that, right? So to the degree that these were once concrete, meaningful things, whereas then now we're just entrapped in the concrete, but the meaning is gone. So Baudrillard is seeing that about our production to our consumption. So he says, while the code of status is at present coming to constitute a universal apparatus of signification that is immediately readable, facilitating the free flow of social representations from one end of society to the other, this does not mean that society is becoming more transparent. No, to the contrary, it's going to need to become more secretive because there's a lot of things to hide, right? So the code produces an illusion of transparency, right? Like the media, like you go there for the truth when, you know, other philosophers, thinkers, and people could have told you 30 years ago, these are the representatives of the ruling and owning classes. They're not here for the normal and average people. They're telling them what you, like the people who show up on TV were there to tell us what reality was. They weren't asking for our opinion. It wasn't ruled by consensus. Like, look, I've lived here in America for 40 years, and the fact that these people still believe they have a democracy, it's going to be really upsetting to them when they realize that they haven't had one in probably at least 50 to 100 years. But kind of going on here, what Baudrillard says, the code produces an illusion of transparency, an illusion of readable social relations, like they're real still, right? Behind which the real structure of production and real societal relationships remain illegible. A society would be transparent only if knowledge of the apparatus of signification was simultaneously knowledge of the structures and social realities. So, right, when God was the highest value, when he was the creator of everything, and he was also your church and also your topic of conversation and also the person who was going to save you. Now, when we all watch different sitcoms, when we all live and go to different places, when we don't even participate in our same local communities, you know, that's the death of God. We just don't believe anymore. We don't uphold it anymore. We don't even care anymore, right? It's not necessarily a bad thing. So a society would be transparent, right? So he's saying that this is not so in the case of objects come advertising system, which offers nothing but a code of meaning that is always complicitous and always opaque. What is more, though it may provide a formal security thanks to its coherence, right? Because there is this neuroticism of security. It's the same kind of thing that, like, in the way that the no, that Aztec's different representation. I was thinking of the way the American might get up at the crack of dawn every day and mow their lawn in stereotypical neurotic fashion. Those kind of little addictions to the stuff, to the maintenance and curation of the objects, and the obsession with the objects shows you how crazy it is. Like, shows you the pathology.
You and your board are idolaters.
And so he's saying that's all complicit. Like, these are all serious rituals that people engage in, but they're really opaque. If you're wondering why these people are obsessed over their lawn or why they're there polishing their car every week when, other people would just buy a new car every week who can afford it, right? Going, why would you treat your objects like that? For us, money ain't a thing, right? Baudrillard says, I know your class not by what you consume, but what you throw away. So Baudrillard goes on further. What is more, though, it may not provide a formal security thanks to its coherence. This code is also the best means for the global social order to extend its imminent and permanent rule to all individuals. It wanted all of you. It wanted all the billions of good little drone dreglings of the world, man, woman, dog, makes no difference, right? It wanted you all in service to this perpetual production and consumption machine, right? Look at that. Let me read that again. The idea that these things are seen as conspiracies are silly when our way of life was becoming transparent in its opaqueness years ago. So again, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. What is more, though it may provide a formal security thanks to its coherence, right? It has the appearance of being real and secure. The bridges, and as Nietzsche would say, and thus spake Zarathustra, as the bridges and bearings, all the values of things. All these things are stable, right? We know the values, we know it works, we know it doesn't work. We modern people, we figured everything out. Similarly, this code is also the best means for the global social order to extend its imminent and permanent rule to all individuals. And again, that's modernity, and that's modernity in stasis forever. And I think this is what Zarathustra saw. This was Nietzsche's nightmare, recognizing that we would freeze time at the most shallow end and ebb of history in a denial of what human beings really are, which is this powerful, catastrophically powerful force themselves. If there was a prima materia on this planet, we were it. We might as well have been it. And our history kind of shows that and demonstrates us as that. But then again, when we became too dangerous for both the women and for society and for the organizing of said materials and objects, which eventually came to be our, simulation of reality, removed from those first order realities that we've differentiated, like the Aztecs cutting out the hearts of uh, enemies or virgins, like that was first order reality because it was all transparent. It was all there. Everyone knew why they did it. There was nothing, while there might have been mystery at its heart, they actually, Baudrillard kind of says that there's this reflection in pagan culture where you could see that they invoked their gods almost to kill them, not to worship or cower underneath them. It was like their own overcoming, right? How else could they arrive at any greater conclusion or believe that they had a place in it if the gods were so all powerful? But before we get too lost there, I want to go on with our talk to symbolic exchange and death. It's interesting. I wanted to get into this talk from Donna Haraway, but maybe I'll just come back and do a sneak peek another day because she has a lot to say specifically on animal husbandry and the genetic code. And what the genetic code is, Leibniz kind of infers with the mathematical code, or rather binary, that ones and zeros are the ideal code, the ideal form, because it's either yes or no, and from it you can get all all combinations of recombinations, to where again we're back to using language as this prima materia, where delusional mythological man begins to think that he is the creator of his own reality, that he is the right? We're just reverting back to these mythological dreams, whether we're going to build it with the matrix and cyberspace, or concrete, or stucco, or all the other building materials. Like in modern terms, it'd be polymers. Polymers are like the prima materia. Oh, along with aluminum, I would say, right? We couldn't have airplanes, we couldn't have flight, we couldn't have space age technologies without this. But I'll save this talk for Donna Haraway because all this stuff always gets out of control way faster than you know it. And I think that's a good place to actually stop this recording. We've been looking at seduced and abandoned, the body in the virtual world, the feminine cyberspace. Maybe I'll come back around and work on some of this later, but I've already been recording for almost 2 hours, and that's going to be way too much material to edit. So if you stopped here, thanks for checking it out. Like, share, subscribe, share it with other people you think who might appreciate it. And if we're here tomorrow, I'll catch you then. Take care. Bye.
This is a huge thing. I mean, you hear about the paradigm shift, but we're like barnacles on the whale of the paradigm shift, and it's very hard for us to orient toward what is happening. We each think we're having our own private adventure with our career, with our sexuality, with our philosophical understanding, with our psychedelic voyages, with our spiritual teachers. But in fact, notice that everybody else is going through something very similar. And the payoff of all of this, I think, is a more comfortable mode of being. That we really do feel the weight of some kind of original sin. We are cast from paradise. We feel flawed, and if we aren't flawed, we rush to invent flaws. So, if agriculture didn't do the trick, then phonetic alphabets surely will. And if that can't, how about monotheism? And if that can't, how about science? And if that can't, how about political correctness? And on and on and on. We flagellate ourselves for our perceived inadequacies, define ourselves as apart from nature, a fallen creature. And we say this came from the church or the corporation or the king, but everybody participated in this particular thought crime along the way. I mean, there were few brave heretics who held out against it. Now there are many heretics who hold out against it and say the distinction between the artificial and the natural, between the male and the female, between the polis and the wilderness, these things must be erased because they are infantile. They are the things of childhood. We have come to the end of our childhood as a species, as a semi-cannibalistic, rape-prone, ravenous, copulating, destroying ape species. Business along those lines is a sure bullet in the head for every man, woman, and child on this planet within 500 years, no question about it. And so, what we pride ourselves on is our flexibility. Well, by God, we're going to be put to the test. Everyone must push themselves and the great enemy to this process, and people say, are you an anarchist? Are you a nihilist? What are you? The great enemy to this process of freeing ourselves for a dynamic future, I believe, is ideology. Not bad ideologies. God knows we have enough of them. But ideology itself is a form of neoteny, a form of self-juvenilization. It's a cop-out. A mature, civilized being lives without closure. Without the closure provided by Freudianism, Marxism, Buddhism, positivism, capitalism, Zen, the Hopi prophecies, the teachings of the Arturians, or anything else, living without closure is honest living, and it's uncomfortable because there's something about the anal retentive primate mind that we want to button it down, and say, well, it's this or it's that, with no sense of irony, no sense of scale, no tongue-in-cheek approach at all. I mean, if you met a termite who aspired to understand the cosmic workings of the universe, you would just roll your eyes at such a naive misunderstanding of one's own position in the cosmos. Well, do you think we stand so far from where the termite stands that our musings about how the cosmos works are carrying much force? I don't think so. Well, then people say, well, but without ideology, I mean, aren't we supposed to reject fascism and choose community? And no. I mean, at a certain stage, yes. But this is the sophomoric stage of becoming an intellectual person. Once you've reached the hoary ages that I now reside in, you see, and notice, I visited my doctor recently, and as I was getting dressed, he said, in the 19th century, most people your age were dead. And I've thought of that remark on many different levels, and I realize culture is a con game designed to bewilder you for 35 to 40 years. And then if by some miracle you can outlive that span of time, a strange realization will begin to dawn as you sit at the poker table. You'll realize this is a bunch of crap. I've been had. Well, up until very recently, only a very few people in any society lived into those ages, and then that was called wisdom. He said, he just sits on his porch and rocks and occasionally chuckles. But now, because the cultural dialogue is so frank, and because so many people live to very ripe old ages, the biologically generated con of culture is being seen through. And the falsity of ideology is exposed for what it is, something that you bamboozle children with for 30 years. But beyond that, it doesn't serve. Well, so then what is to fill this void that has always been filled by passionate convictions, regardless of what they might happen to be? What is to fill the void is what I call, and I mentioned it earlier, the felt presence of immediate experience. The felt presence of immediate experience. This is sufficient. It's hard for us, armored as we are, and defocused from the moment as we are by our previous imbibing of toxic cultural values. Occasionally we touch this. Well, I think psychedelics are the way back, that you can train yourself. And there may be other roads back, meditation and so forth. But psychedelics is the fast track, I would argue, to a sense of here and nowness, a sense of bodhi mind, a sense of stillness, a sense of connectivity to the Gaian intent. And with that, the morphogenetic dynamic that is unfolding becomes exhilarating, adventuresome. Trust, you can reach down into it and trust nature. Without it, it's all paranoia, and should I stockpile food, and what should I do with my investments, and where am I going to run to given this catastrophe, that catastrophe? People are so agitated by the notion of the end of the world, and yet don't seem to notice that the end of their world is a pretty sure bet. Most people are dead. I hate to be the one to break it to you. Whatever dead means, we don't know. But most people are in that condition. And so it shall come to us, presumably, in one form or another. Well, compared to your own self-extinction, issues like the end of the world seem like fairly abstract political matters. So I think that corporate capitalism and object fetishism, which seem to be two human traits that cross-fertilize each other, are run on anxiety. And that this anxiety trivializes what it is to be human, and that all of nature waits upon human beings to awake from the delusion of history and to re-embrace the living processes that nature represents. And the medium of exchange are the psychedelics. They are very mysterious. Anybody who thinks they simply, through perturbation of brain chemistry or something, allow, I don't know, repressed material from the personal unconscious to come into focus. This is such a dumbing down of what it is. These things carry intelligence, far greater intelligence than our own. An ocean of alien intelligence moves through the vegetable world, which is ancient beyond imagining on this planet. I mean, it goes back 500, 600 million years. And an ocean of very strange intelligence, but approachable, at least approachable enough to be identifiable as intelligence, resides there. And we have wandered from this, and in our hubris built these paranoid schemes into our behaviors that I call cultural values, and they have pushed us now into very precarious places. So it's time to come back. And, this is pretty eggheady stuff. You can't shout this on the street corners. But as I said, we represent the upper 5% of the pyramid of privilege and connectivity on this planet. And if we can begin to talk this way, think about things in these terms, transcend ideologies, we will move forward, and we will assuage the anxiety of those less fortunate and further down on the social pyramid. And I'm really serious about this ideological thing. I mean, because I see that there's a kind of bifurcation, which I almost said ahead, but no, we are in this bifurcation right now. And it's whether we shall fragment into cult or embrace this thing I'm talking about, which is living without closure. Cult is no answer. Cult is the old answer repackaged in smaller sizes. No human being has greater insight into your circumstance than you do. If you've somehow managed to convince yourself that this is not the case, you need to seriously think it through, because our perspectives are unique. We can generalize from one person to another, but no one is in a position to claim leadership. It's unnecessary. The dynamic of the situation is larger than any single human being. And anyone who says, I understand, I know, follow me, is certainly not to be invited home to dinner or tithed to, or because no one knows. It is a mystery. And a mystery is not an unsolved problem. This is what science has led us to assume. All mysteries, you hire people, they gather data, the mystery goes away. Only the trivial edges of the mystery can be illuminated in that fashion. The core of being is pure contradiction. Life is death. Death is life. The past is the future. The present is eternity. And comprehending this is not to become some kind of ivory tower intellectual. Comprehending this is to move past intellectual concepts to actually embrace love. Love is what waits beyond abandoning the search for closure. Love is not closure. Love is challenge, emotion, being in the purest sense, not becoming. This is the realm of becoming, and it is always striving and it is always incomplete. Love is the realm of true being, and it lies beyond the prison of culture, beyond the prison of ideology, beyond the prison of self-defined limitations. Thank you. In other words, if the world is an idea, why isn't it the way we want it to be? Why is it so resistant if it is so plastic? So my approach has been, and I recommend this to you and to especially young people who are just starting out into the jungles and ashrams of this world, here's how I operated. I investigated the weird by rational means, and I was never a believer. And my theory went like this: the truth is the truth. It does not require the cooperation of Terence McKenna. On the other hand, all deception does require my cooperation. So lean as hard as you want on the flying saucer witness, the guru, the method. Lean as hard as you want, because the real thing can take your leaning. Truth will not crumble before your critical onslaught. Bullshit will. And it drives me crazy when people approach a given, let's say, spiritual or paranormal phenomena reverently, with eyes averted, never asking the hard question, never slamming it. And then, of course, mountebanks, frauds, charlatans get the upper hand in that situation. So I say of a spiritual doctrine, a anomalous phenomenon, a spiritual teacher, kick the tires, honk the horn, drive it around the block. The truth can take and will pass all tests. And here's the good news. Some people think that if you have that attitude, the mystery will be not found, that it will retreat ahead of you and that you will be left in an existential desert. Not so. I'm the living proof of that. I was as hard-nosed as I could possibly be. I was as brutal as I could possibly be. And there is unimaginable strangeness. Not at Zenebel-Ganubi or Proxima Centauri, but, North Denver. Phenomenal weirdness haunts the world nearby. And you can find it if you are not distracted by false weirdness. And there is so much false weirdness these days that I feel almost like I'm trying to save people from the clutches of all this New Age banditry that's about. So that's that. Well, at the risk of dragging the reluctant into places they didn't think they'd go this evening, this is a fascinating thing. This is close to my heart, this question, because, first of all, let me background this as I understand it for you. Probability theory is a way of understanding nature that has been evolved primarily in the last couple of 100 years, and it is the primary tool of modern science. And roughly it works like this. If you want to know something, like let's say how much electricity is flowing through a wire, the way to find this out is to measure the electricity 10 times, add those numbers together, and divide by 10. You now have a number called the average voltage moving through this wire. Now you might immediately notice that this number need not be identical to any of the numbers which you added together. In other words, it does not agree with a single measurement that you made. It is the average of those measurements. Now, I maintain that science has made a fundamental error. It's an understandable error, but it's not a forgivable error. And the error that science has made is this: in the application of probability theory to nature. Probability theory assumes, on the basis of no evidence, but for purposes of simplification, probability theory assumes that when you make a measurement does not matter. That to specify that the measurement of the voltage moving through the wire was made on a Thursday rather than a Tuesday is utterly irrelevant to the question how much voltage is flowing through the wire. Now, and probability theory has gotten a long way with this simplification. Modern science is its crowning achievement and all the technical toys that flow therefrom. But for 50 years, it's been well understood by at least some people that truly complex phenomena just do not yield to this method of analysis. Can you understand love affairs by taking 100 of them, adding them together, and dividing by 100, and then getting the generic love affair? Can you understand a corporate takeover or a social revolution by this method? No. So all higher order phenomena, and interestingly notice those were all sociological examples, all higher order phenomena that involve systems as complex as human systems, when you try to treat them statistically, you get a travesty. You get a cartoon, a flattening of the human affect that totally betrays the phenomenon. So I have proposed and worked out at great length, and I won't attempt to transmit it to you this evening because it's impossible and to some degree boring. But what I've looked at is, what if we were to accept the idea that probability is actually fluctuating? You see, when you say that time is invariant, as the statisticians do, you're turning time into what's called an Aristotelian absolute. It's not a thing. It's an idea. Time for probability theory is pure duration. This was Newton's phrase, pure duration. In other words, time is this mathematical dimension that you put stuff into so that its seriality is preserved. But I would suggest that time is a thing as much a thing as water is, certainly as much a thing as thought is. Time is a thing, a part of the physical universe, like light, energy, matter, time. And no phenomenon in nature has ever been found to be mathematically perfect. You know, the Greeks thought the planets moved in perfect circles because they were gods, and so they had to behave perfectly. But they discovered they then couldn't predict planetary motion, and it took, centuries of beating their heads against this wall before somebody said, try an ellipse. And bingo, perfect observation and prediction matching. But the ellipse is not a perfect Aristotelian, Platonic form, and hence it was unsatisfying. Well, one by one, science abandoned these perfect mathematical objects as descriptive of nature, with the single exception of this Newtonian notion of pure duration, which views time as a perfectly smooth surface. No matter at how great a magnification you zoom in by a power of 100 million, it's still perfectly smooth. Zoom in another power of 100 million, it's still perfectly smooth. Well, nothing in nature behaves like that. So why not entertain the rather messy idea that time probability fluctuates? When you study probability theory, the first thing they teach you on day one is this. They tell you, memorize this: chance has no memory. And then they give this example. A man has flipped a coin 49 times, and 49 times it has come up heads. Now he is flipping for the 50th time. what are the odds the coin will come up heads? And if you are a good student and expect to pass this course, the answer is 50-50. The coin does not know, does not remember that it's already come up 49 times in a row, a certain designation. But now, if you put that problem to a gambler, the gambler would say, well, I'll bet heads, because it's on a run. Now, a run is a concept of a runnel in time. It's not the Aristotelian perfection. Notice that if it were really true that the odds of heads or tails were 50-50, if it were really, really, really true in a Platonic universe, then the coin would land on its edge every single time. You have to haunt some really low bars to find surfaces so sticky that the coin will land upright every time. And then you take this to a statistician. You say, why doesn't the coin land on its edge each time? And they say, well, there were secondary factors. And you say, well, what are they? And we say, well, we don't, obviously they're there because it was one or the other. And you get all this flim-flam. So I think, and this leads into deeper water, I'm the proponent of something which I call novelty theory. And novelty theory is the idea that over long periods of time, complexification is actually favored over entropic dissipation. And the one way I say this is I say nature is a novelty-conserving engine. Nature, having once produced something interesting, a new molecule, a new species, a new form of matter, nature will tenaciously hang on to that. Nature does not easily allow herself to be pushed backward. Occasionally there are speed bumps, there are hesitations. It's not a smooth ascent into complexity, but every time the vector of complexity is deflected, it quickly rights itself and returns to the process. And I maintain that we ourselves are a manifestation of this phenomenon. That after organic evolution running for 700 million years on the surface of this planet, the nature's preference for novelty, nature's conservation of complexity has led not only to extremely advanced higher animals with superb binocular vision and muscular coordination and acoustical skills, and but also has added the new sheen of cultural epigenetic behaviors, tool making, mathematics, music, dance, theater, humor. And so people say, well, your belief that we are on a collision course with some kind of singularity of complexity, doesn't that seem to you highly improbable that in the entire course of the universe you would happen to find yourself so lucky as to be in the immediate domain of a concrescent complexification? And the answer is no, we are part of this concrescent complexification. In other words, the presence of tool-using, language-using, culture-building animals on this planet is the intimation of the approach of the other. We are the outer edge of the shock wave of eschatology. Nature has pulled us forth out of being as simple witnesses to a much more complex phenomenon still to come, of which we will be a part. And I think that eventually I feel very confident, not of necessarily the mathematical details of my formulation of this theory, but that it will be found that there is built into nature, just like the speed of light and Planck's constant and the charge of the electron, a preference for the conservation of complexity. And if that's true, you see, without kneeling down to anthropomorphic gods, we can abandon existential nihilism and all this rap about how we're the chance witnesses lucky to be here and the universe is flinging itself from meaninglessness to greater meaninglessness. And no, not at all. Suddenly, we've uncovered the thread of the cosmic drama. Nature loves complexity. We are, in our hood, the most complex game around. Therefore, nature loves us. And immediately an ethic is implied. That which preserves and advances complexity serves the universal purpose. That which degrades, betrays, and destroys complexity serves the negentropic tendency that nature, at least organic nature, but I maintain all nature, is struggling to overcome. So this is very exciting to me, that we could uncover an ethical vector in the universe and align ourselves with it. As far as a bibliographic citation for a critique against probability theory, I think probably this talk is some of the most detail that's ever been given to the subject.
You and your board are idolaters.